Hi, I'm Christina Leston-Bandeira from the University of Hull in the UK, and I'm going to talk to you about parliaments and social media, and the sort of ways parliaments have been using social media, but also some of the challenges associated with that. And I've got some notes here, so I'll be looking every so often to my notes, make sure that I'm saying what I had planned to say. And before we talk about actually how parliaments have been using social media, it's important to remember that technology and parliaments really do not go well together. They're not the best bedfellows. And there's lots of reasons for that, and they come really usually from the fact of the characteristics of the institution of Parliament. Parliament is not an institution like any others. It's a collective institution. It doesn't have a clear leadership that represents the whole of the institution. You'll have many different groups in there. Quite often those groups actually go against each other, have different agendas. In some cases, like the European Parliament for instance, some of those groups don't actually want the institution to exist. So it's an institution by itself that faces difficulties in its management and its structure. So it's an institution by itself has got very slow decision making, and that represents everything that's happening in the institution. Now bring in the technology, and obviously as we all know, technology moves very fast. It doesn't really do very well in a place where decision making process is very slow. So adapting to technology has always been very slow for the institutions of Parliament. All of this compounds it even more difficulties with social media, because social media is even faster, it's transitory. It also implies a style of communication, a type of voice that Parliament's not necessarily used to having. So you may have individual politicians, obviously, using the arguments they want to use to defend specific policies, and they're politicians that do that. But as an institution, the institutional communication needs to be non-political or non-partisan, let's say. So Parliament may be announcing what they're doing, maybe talking about different policies they're doing, legislation, scrutiny, all sorts of activities. But all of this communication, if you think about it, if it's not through a party group or through a politician, if it's through a parliamentary official or through the institution, it has to be non-political, non-partisan. And that brings a difficulty specific to social media, because as we all know, social media is there for dialogue, conversation, engagement, ideas, and all of those things. It's difficult to do without bringing in the party politics, and all of this explains to some extent why parliaments have been quite slow in adopting social media, whereas other organisations might have been a bit faster. Not only in slow adopting social media, but also not necessarily using social media in the way that we might think they should be using. So using it in a very institutional way, not necessarily to engage and to have a dialogue or interaction that we would expect from those tools. From a study that I did last year in 2013, we did an overview of all national parliaments across the whole of the world, and we saw that 29% of those parliaments by then were using either Facebook or Twitter or both, and many others were using also YouTube, Flickr, all sorts of different tools. So 29%, it's a quite small percentage, but then if you think about actually the intake on that, if I did the same study today, this year, I would probably see an increase of about 10%, which is how it's been in terms of how it's been developing and the acceleration in terms of adoption. Interestingly, there's actually huge differences across different continents in the way parliaments are using social media. So at the time, for instance, in Europe, the adoption of social media here was just Facebook and Twitter, just to be clear. In Europe, it was just 35% of adoption by then. I imagine today, 2014, will be much higher than that in Europe. But Latin America, it was 42%. Latin America is actually a very good space to look at these tools, and it's a place where participatory tools of democracy, engagement with the institutions, have developed much more than, say, in Europe. And there's many cases of really good practice happening there. Now, the other aspect that our study showed is that, and in here we were focusing with this analysis mainly in Europe, whether parliaments were using Facebook or Twitter, sort of social media, mainly to report on business. To a lot of the tweets or the Facebook posts were about timetabling, for instance, or announcing specific bills and that sort of thing. So not the sort of thing you might be using your social media for, or you might be using for that, but you'd expect also an interaction and discussion. And in some of these parliaments, 80% of the activity was about just reporting business rather than engaging or having any type of engagement activity which was not related just to pure reporting. Now, having said that, there's actually lots of examples of good practice, and I think we are now at a point of a shift in terms of how parliaments adopt that. And there's some early adapters, but there's also some sort of later players coming into, let's call it, the game, that are starting to develop very good practice. But there's a huge divide between those institutions that still have no social media tools, channels whatsoever, those who just starting to use but very slowly adopting it just for announcing things, very cautious, and then you've got some which are well ahead of the game with doing all sorts of things. So you've got a little bit of everything at the moment. And I'd like just to speak about 4 case studies on sort of the examples of good practice you can see. One of them is European Parliament. The European Parliament, for all the criticism it has, it's an institution that has invested on web communications very early on, much earlier than other parliaments, or much more heavily, let's say, with a strategy and a proper way of thinking how to use these tools. And the adoption of Facebook was very much pioneering in Europe, and still today they use it in a very engaging way, in a very innovative way. And they've done something which parliaments find difficult to do, which is integrating the political voice. And the way they've done that is by integrating, say, politicians into the actual channels. And there's lots of other ways that has been done, that the European Parliament has done it. But they have taken it to a different level in terms of complexity and having that individual political voice that engages citizens, either by bringing politicians in so they can say their views, or simply by doing things like engaging with quizzes or ideas, or discussing, actually going towards putting different points of view on a specific policy, being very careful not being party political, which is a very difficult thing for parliaments to do. The other example I wanted to talk about is the Scottish Parliament, so not national parliament, a European Parliament, obviously supranational level. With the Scottish Parliament, they actually came in quite late into social media, if you look at when they adopted. But it's an institution that right from the beginning, when it was set up, it was very much about engaging and participation and openness to citizens. So when they adopted social media, they sort of knew already what they needed to do. They knew the rules of the game of engaging with the citizens, not just about announcing. And it's an institution that has adapted very well. And if you look at their Twitter account, for instance, you'll see there's a lot of discussion in there actually happening, or simply sort of what I would call more symbolic representation engagement, talking about the institution, the values of the institution, what it represents, its heritage and that sort of thing. So not just about announcing business. The other case I wanted to mention is the Brazilian Parliament. Both the lower chamber and the upper chamber are incredibly innovative in this area, and I would advise anyone to have a look at their websites, not only in terms of integrating citizens' views in public hearings in committees, for instance, integrating people's views on policy making, legislation being discussed, having citizens integrate, bringing in new ideas for legislation. And they have a variety of social media channels which they use in quite in an innovative way. The main idea from there is the way all of that is integrated into the institution, which works really well. When I say works really well, obviously none of these things, it's like the magic bullet that doesn't exist. All of these examples will have problems with them. I was just trying to give some ideas. The final case study I wanted to mention is actually the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament, obviously a very traditional institution, and in the way it's used Twitter through the institutional general accounts, it has been very traditional. But quite recently, sort of the last year, 2 years, they've started developing a more strategic way of adopting digital engagement and having a digital outreach team to deal with digital engagement. And so, for instance, they've used very effectively hashtags to engage citizens, to put questions to select committee public hearings, so a hearing with a minister or secretary of state, citizens putting those questions through hashtag, being selected by the committee, clerks, officials, which then take to the MPs, and those being integrated into the actual hearing. One of those actually led then to a change in legislation at local government level. They've also done things like trying to take the conversation outside Parliament, and that again I think is quite a good example. So engaging with particular groups, say groups of students, groups of people who engage with the nursing community, or money advice on money and consumer rights, that sort of things. So going outside Parliament and hosting, say, a forum in a website which is not in Parliament, or engaging those communities through Twitter, through the use of hashtags. And there's a number of examples quite recent on that level that have taken place. And there's quite a bit of information on that online. If anyone wants to get in touch with me about this, I would be more than happy to point those examples. So there are some good examples taking place, but obviously adoption is very slow, and as it happens, as that slow adoption is happening, we are all using social media every day. There's more tools, more ways of doing, more creative ideas, and individual companies do that much better than an institution like Parliament would do. So it's always going to be difficult to actually keep that pace. And the main two challenges in there is the finding the voice, that parliaments find that quite challenging to engage citizens in a way that is not partisan, that is not political, but at the same time engaging and discussing ideas. It's very difficult to do that. It's not impossible, and there's examples of how to do that, but it's something that parliaments are still learning how to do. And the other one is resources. We often don't think about that, but having these channels of social media, it's an extra layer of resources to bring to parliaments. And some of these parliaments, for instance, they may have 2 people, 5 people to deal with any online content, to do their website or anything else. And there's not necessarily an understanding of how much that requires, a different type of strategy, different skills also. Quite often Parliament staff don't necessarily have those skills, and all of that requires an investment, and it's not as simple as just opening, say, a Facebook account. It needs maintaining, it needs to make sense, it needs to engage, and for that you need time, you need staff with the right skills to do that. And again, that's a key challenge for parliaments to address. So I think I've covered everything I wanted to say, and I focus mainly at the institutional level. I'm very aware of that. I think politicians or MPs have other challenges, and there's plenty of examples of good practice and bad practice in there, but they are very much adopting it more and more and integrating that into their own practice. And in terms of generations, it will come and it will adopt it much more quickly. I think that the actual challenges are more at the institutional level. How does the institution adopt social media in a way that is engaging and that actually brings the citizens closer to the institution, or shows the institution open to the citizens? Okay, well, I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to hear from you. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, please do. Just Google my name, Christina Leston-Bandeira, at the University of Hull in the UK. Thank you, bye-bye.